what we're going to do is we're going to cover First Samuel chapter 7 primarily. There's a, there's two basic things that we're going to get into today. Um, if everybody can mute out for me.
Sorry.
Uh, so we know from last week the Ark of the Covenant had been taken by the Philistines, and they returned it back to Beth Shemesh, which was a town that was on the border of the Philistine territory, and that same plague that struck the five city states of the Philistines appears to have struck them as well, and thousands died from that. So they don't want to hang on to the ark, so it's passed up the line to another town just up the road, which we'll get into here in a minute, and we'll look at how the ark resided for the next 20 years in one location, but the tabernacle would be in another location, and the separation of the two would remain until finally they were both brought into the city of David, and eventually the temple would be built by Solomon. But the separation of the two would lead to, and we're going to talk about this a little, and not now, but later on, would be lead to splitting into two different priesthoods. We're going to have the descendants of Ithamar. They're going to be they're still related to Eli and his sons, and they're going to stay with the ark. I'm sorry, with the tabernacle. But the descendants of Pinchas, who had the salt covenant, all the way down to the Zadoks, they would remain with the ark. Eventually, we know that the Zadoks are going to be the only priests that will minister before the Lord during the millennial reign. And so the splitting up of the priesthood, you're going to see this all through Saul's reign into David's reign, and it'll finally be brought together at the end after he fights off, basically the enemies, which really are sons in a couple civil wars. So without further ado, let's just kind of jump into this. Now, with the destruction of Shiloh, and by the way, if anybody wants to know a little bit about this, Dr. Ken Strickland out of Katy, Texas, he is doing the current digs on Shiloh, and they believe they've discovered exactly where the ark should have been, and and recently, within the last few weeks, they found out where the chair that the Eli was sitting on when he fell backwards. They found where he would have been positioned on that, which is kind of interesting. So I would look up Dr. Strickland. He's got his own website, and then he's also a lot of videos he does on YouTube. But with the destruction of Shiloh in 1 Samuel 4, a generational loss was done by Eli and his two sons. It created a leadership vacuum, and you're going to see that things there as a result of this, there's going to be a period before Samuel really grabs the reins as judge, and the loss of Eli, and we'll see through as we look at why the tabernacle and the ark are split. But in Deuteronomy 12, verse 8, it says, "You shall not at all do as we are doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in their own eyes." And I would just want to frame that argument or that statement right there, because we are currently in the United States and in the kingdom throughout the world. Everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. Everybody has their own ideas of the way the kingdom should be run or how worship should be done. And we are actually in a period of the judges, if you will, a time before the rise of Yeshua, before our king comes and rules and reigns. And so that statement right there in Deuteronomy is completely applicable to us today. With the thousands and thousands of denominations, the dozens and dozens of sects within Judaism, and really, it's kind of the ripping of the kingdom that's taken place, and so that's why you're seeing all kinds of different various forms of worship and what people think is correct and not correct. For as you yet have not come to the rest, and that key word is come to the rest, and the inheritance which the Lord your God is giving you. But when you cross over the Jordan, dwell in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all your enemies round about, so that you dwell in safety. And then there will be a place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide. There shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the heave offerings, heave offerings of your hand, and all your choice offerings which you vow to the Lord. So I want to concentrate it on this idea of rest. Um, what happens before King David sits on the throne and will rule from Jerusalem, the most important thing that he has to do is he has to defeat the enemies of God, the ones that are keeping Israel from taking over the inheritance. And and those enemies are inside the house and outside the house. Now we see around Israel, Israel current, which with the house of Judah is originally what we should call them. They have, they fought against in Gaza. They fought in Iran. They're fighting in Syria. They're fighting in Lebanon. They're fighting and all around them. And when you see that happening currently and back when King David rose to power, that is a sign of the coming of the Davidic kingdom. And that's very important because once the rise of a king, he sets in place, he will build the temple, and the temple will usher in that rest. And that rest is what they're talking about. And we can connect the rest back to the 7 days of creation. You have 6 days of work, and then at the end of that 6 days, we ushered into a rest, and our king sits on his throne in the east of the garden. I'm sorry, west of the garden. He sits in a position as a throne. And by doing that, that's a shadow of things to come in the future. And so we're going to see these types and shadows, and these wording is really crucial to understanding what's going on here in 1 Samuel. Now, when Joshua first came into the land with the people of Israel, they established what I'm going to use a military term, a beachhead in a place called Gilgal. It was centrally located. They put the tabernacle there. The priests were set up there, and then they would go out and they had to clear the south first. So the southern area of the inheritance had to be cleared first, and so that was primarily Judah. Benjamin was in the Gilgal area, and then Simeon was helped by Judah to get Beersheba and the part to the south. And then once that was done, then Joseph and go ahead.
Question in Joshua's southern campaign, were there 12 cities in the south and then 12 cities in the north that he had to conquer?
Yeah, they say that, but there's much more. That's kind of you'll see that they'll use those 12, and you're going to see it here. You're going to see God uses that because these are patterns. It's teaching something about the 12 tribes getting the inheritance, and you're going to see it even in here in chapter 7. They're going to use that 12 in that same instance. So yes, exactly. That's exactly what. Obviously, there was many more cities and much more terrain and territory that had to be conquered. But the template that's being established in the south was 12, and then the north. And what's critical to understanding, if you use biblical terms, not cultural terms, the house of Judah had to get their territory first before the house of Israel would get it. And the house of Judah, or the Jews, or the Judah, never helped Joseph get their inheritance, ever. And if you go back and read the story, they did it on their own. And one of the reasons why it says that Ephraim and Manasseh couldn't completely dislodge the Canaanites because they were fighting these battles primarily themselves. And so, and this plays out all the way into when King David is anointed, and he's not anointed over all of Israel. He's anointed to just over Judah. And so you're seeing this tug of war taking place then, when they come into the land under Joshua, and then later on when they're trying to unite the kingdom under Saul. So this tug of war continues going on. After Joseph took control of their inheritance, the tabernacle was then moved to Shiloh from Gilgal. It would go first to Shechem. They would do the renewal of covenant there at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. It would sit there for about a year or so, and then it would move completely into Shiloh. But they had to do that renewal of covenant right there at those two mountains. And if Shiloh was destroyed, then the people would go back to they would go back to worshiping in the way they had prior to. And that's what ended up happening. People began, and we're going to talk a little about they would set up their own altars, private altars. And in those private altars, they were allowed a little bit of leeway when Shiloh was destroyed. But according to, if you look back here in Deuteronomy, once God established his name there and places his name there, the people could not go to the high places and or have private altars at their homes. But when Shiloh and Jerusalem were not established, then it went back to it. And we're going to see that they finally made a decision after it was established in Jerusalem that could never take place again. Um, so, who does not know about the Mishnah? I'll just ask a question because a lot of people don't know what the Mishnah is there for and what it means. Does anybody not know what the Mishnah what's its purpose? Well, my question. So the Mishnah primarily is the interpretations of the Sanhedrin from the time they came out of Mount Sinai all the way until the destruction of the temple and then the return by Ezra and Nehemiah. So anything that you see in the Mishnah was finally captured in writing these interpretations. I'll give you an example. So like in at Mount Sinai, when they say, okay, the incense for the altar of incense is composed of X amount of elements, they only mentioned 4, right? And the anointing oil is only mentions a couple things. But the actual true recipe is in the Mishnah, because in the Mishnah is the Sanhedrin capturing exactly what it is. So there's a lot of things in scripture that that are not going to be stated outright and written. And so there's things that happen that the Levites and the priests have to do as part of their jobs that is going to be part of what I call the oral Torah, which is the Mishnah. And it's really important. So when they go back and try, and then when we go back and try to rebuild this third temple, they're going to have to dissect the Mishnah and plus other stuff that they have, other writings to look at exactly how do you run the day-to-day operations at the temple. So a lot of people, they lump the Talmud and the Mishnah in the same category. They are not in the same category. They have 2 different purposes. And but for now, Zevakim is one of the books of the Mishnah, and we're going to kind of quote that and kind of get some understanding of some of the interpretations. Okay. So does anybody have any questions on that? Okay. So the Mishnah is also referred to as the oral Torah, the rulings of the Sanhedrin. And we find in Zevakim, which means the offerings. In 14:6, it says, when the Jewish people arrived at Gilgal, private altars were permitted. Offerings of the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains, and offerings of lesser sanctity were eaten anywhere. So what I want to do is to divide the difference between what is a lesser offering and what a greater offering. And we learned this from the book of Leviticus, but out of the bat, it's based on value and cost. So animals like bulls and rams, being more expensive and harder to acquire, were considered greater offerings compared to smaller offerings like doves and pigeons, or even grain offerings or flour offerings. So a hatat, a sham, and minka offerings that are which are the sin, guilt, and grain offerings, they had to be done within the curtains. These are greater offerings. The peace offerings, your vows, your Nazarite vows, and things of that nature could be done as private offerings when Shiloh wasn't in place, was burned down. Some burnt offerings allowed. We're going to give you, I'll give you some verses with that. And Thanksgiving offerings are allowed. And most of this is done on what's called the bamots, or the high places. Now, on these bamots, eventually, when King Josiah of Judah rises to power, they had been still, even though there was a temple that was in Jerusalem, the people were still burning incense and still doing these lesser offerings up on the high places. So King Josiah goes and destroys all of that, and he chased all those false priests out of the territories. They would eventually come back when he died, and then when King Hezekiah rose to power, he had to do the same thing. He had to go up to these high places and destroy all this stuff because these private offerings were still going on. and basically much of it got intermingled with the occult and a lot of the practices of the nations that were around them. And this is really the crux of the matter, is the fact that when you look at it, people doing what's right in their own eyes always leads to intermixing with idolatry, always mixes with the ways the nations do it. And you see this within Christianity. Christianity has adopted so many practices just thrown in because they're doing what's right in their own eyes based on pretty much the shadow of the Catholic Church that covers everything. And so people have inherited these practices like as if they're off doing their offerings on the high places. Today, the same things are going on. And so until there is a unified worship, then you're going to see this going on until the return of our Messiah. I know. Go ahead.
So it seems like when you've done this before in the past, where we would look at different verses from the apostolic writings, and you'd say oral Torah or written Torah, and in terms, and you kind of have to know the context that the apostles were talking about when they were using one term versus another. And it seems as though even non-messianic rabbis will say that Jesus was a reformer, so to speak. And it seems like a lot of, and what it seems that he's really, when he's talking about what the Sanhedrin is doing or what the rabbis are doing, they're following Mishnah rather than actual Torah. Is that the way you view that?
So sometimes a lot of the yes and no. Okay, so a lot of the oral Torah are in. I'll give an example. Solomon created an oral Torah. These two women, right? One has a baby, and they're roommates, right? And then the baby's rolls during the night. The baby's killed because somebody rolls over on it, and so one cries out, and so what does Solomon do? He brings them both in there, and he says, "Well, we're just going to cut them in half and split it, right?" So he makes a ruling, right? And then the real mother cries out and says, "No, no, no, no. That's just take it, right?" The real mother does, and then Solomon makes a decision, right? He makes a ruling, okay, and the ruling as a king is not written in scripture, right? But he makes a ruling of justice and righteousness. And so that ruling, because he is anointed, because the priest and the Sanhedrin are anointed, then they have the right to make rulings and interpretations by law from the very beginning, because they were established that way. What happens is when you get into the Talmud, you have two or three different rabbis making interpretations of those interpretations. Okay. And that's where the confusion, that's where the layers of bureaucracy that was laid onto the people came from, is because you were making interpretations upon interpretations. Now, that being said, you have another political battle that took place between the House of Hillel and House of Shammai. And most of the House of Shammai were made up of Sadducees, most of them, not all, but most of them. Okay, and so they had a strict interpretation of that everything that was written in the Torah itself, the first 5 books, we would live our lives based on that. Well, the Pharisees believed in not only just Torah, but the prophets and the writings, and they believed, in a lot of things that Yeshua lines up with. Okay. But it's interesting that in 5 AD, when there's this massacre that takes place, Tyler, where 18 from the Sanhedrin from the house of Hillel were murdered, right there on the steps outside the Sanhedrin, near where the copper basin where they wash their hands. There was 18 that were killed there. Okay, that caused a split, a rip. The people that would be called Essenes later on, they were made up of primarily from the house of Hillel, some from Shammai, and other schools. They pulled completely out in about 5 AD, and they went and set out in the desert and created their own system, right? Okay. So the ones who took over from that point on was by dictator only. It was the house of Shammai. And the house of Shammai would survive until basically Gamaliel would take over. This is the one that John and Peter had to stand before him, right? And when Gamaliel took over, then there was a change in the wind, and the house of Hillel began to take over the leadership. Okay. And when that happened, the modern rabbis, the modern Pharisaic movement came from Gamaliel and the interpretations. Okay. So one of the things that came out of 5 AD was this belief, and there's two things a couple things that Yeshua went in after him, was the fact that there was no longer proselytizing. Okay. And so there's this juggernaut going on, whether, you know, you bring a Roman centurion into your house and break bread with them. Well, that came out of the strictness that was made in 5 AD. That's what you're looking at. And then so there was a big political battle. And so in Matthew, remember when in Matthew it talks about the seven woes, and it references you have blood on your hand, one of the woes. It's referring back to that event in 5 AD. That's what it's referring back to. And so it's a little, it's, you know, when we try to say, well, those are just Pharisees, and what we do without the proper context and understanding and the political machinations going on, we take a broad stroke and say all of it's bad and it's only this or that, and that's just not the way it works. You had to have interpretations because they were given that, or that was ordained by at Mount Sinai. I hope everybody understands that. Go ahead, Mom.
I think you mean BC, because you're talking during Jesus' time. It had to be before Jesus was
No,
born.
so
AD, 5
it's
AD would
about
be
5
after
AD.
Matthew.
He was about 7 or 8 years old when this all took place. Yeah. So
Oh.
But
keep in
Paul
mind,
sat under Gamaliel. Wasn't Paul a student or a
yes,
apostle of Gamaliel?
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
and part of, I mean, we can say 2,000 years later with clarity, their sin was they were not prepared for a Messiah, their Messiah. We can see that clearly, right? But they can't, because they were caught up in the politics. They're caught up, you know, the authoritarian rule of the Romans. So there's a lot of things that were on them that kept them from seeing things clearly unless the Spirit of God revealed it to them. And even the apostles themselves, like we dealt with a few weeks ago, we talked about that. The apostles themselves, it took them a while for it to click in their minds as well. So I just don't throw stones. I just don't do that, because if I was stuck in that time, I might have had the blindness as well, you know. So all right, let's go back and read a little bit of Zevakim, and then we'll keep going through this. So in 14:7 it says, when they arrived at Shiloh, private altars were prohibited, and there was no roof or wood or stone there, i.e. in the tabernacle in Shiloh. In other words, it was still, they had semi fortifications, but most of it was still the tabernacle. Rather, there was only a building of stone below, and the curtains of the roof of the tabernacle were spread above it. And the period of the tabernacle was in Shiloh was characterized in the Torah as rest. This is really important, because where God wanted to place his name, that's where his tabernacle, that's where his presence was. For you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which the Lord your God has given you. And they quote here in the Mishnah from Deuteronomy 12:9. Offerings of the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains in the courtyard of the tent of meeting, and offerings of lesser sanctity and the second tithe were eaten in any place that overlooked Shiloh. And so what they mean by that is that uh, in the tabernacle itself, there were tents or buildings that were constructed to the left and right on both sides, and there was a place specifically where all the where all the um, where all the peace offerings were done, and they would eat with the priest in those tents. And so that's what they're talking about. It didn't have to be within the tent itself. It would be side what would later become the buildings associated with the temple. Keep going here, and I didn't read it, Mom. I'll read it in a second. Let me come to the rest of this. So in verse 7, it says of Sevakim, it says, when Shiloh was destroyed, see 1 Samuel 4:18, The Jewish people arrived with the tabernacle at Nob, depending on how you pronounce it, and later at Gibeon. And private altars were permitted again. Offerings in the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains in the courtyard of the tent of meeting, and offerings of lesser sanctuary eaten in all the cities of the land of Israel. So, so let's take a real world look at Scripture and see this taking place. Mom, go ahead. What was your question or your comment?
No, I just misunderstood. I thought you said 500 AD and you said 5 AD. Sorry.
Yeah, 580. Okay. All right. So, in Judges 13, verse 15, we see this interesting thing take place. And I want you to, hopefully you can pick up on some of the words here. So the Manoah, this is the father Samson, said to the angel of the Lord, please let us detain you, and we will prepare a young goat for you. And the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, though you detain me, I will not eat your food. Very interesting, right? But if you offer a burnt offering, you must offer it to the Lord. For Manoah did not know he was the angel of the Lord. Verse 17 says, then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, what is your name? Now I want you guys to really drill down on this. And that when your words come to pass, we may honor you. And the angel of the Lord said to him, why do you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful? Okay, now this is awesome. Okay, this is really great. Now, the word he uses as wonderful is the word pili. Okay, this is the same word that's used in Isaiah 9:6 for wonderful counselor. Same word, right? Same Hebrew word. So he is basically revealing that this angel of the Lord here really is the pre-incarnate Messiah. This is Yeshua before he came in the first century, right? And he's identifying himself, but he's doing it mysteriously. And this has been a if you read a lot of the stuff from the Midrash and a lot of things that Rambam and Rashi write, they think the angel of the Lord, these are some of the ideas. The angel of the Lord is Michael. The angel of the Lord is just another angel, just any angel. But they never see the divine nature of the angel of the Lord that's being revealed from the time they come out of Egypt all the way until his name changes to Adonai Sevaot, which is the captain of the army. So there is a period of 400 years where he's revealed to Israel as the angel of the Lord. And in this conversation with Manoah, Samson's father, he actually reveals his divine nature, who he really is. It's really amazing. Okay. Guys, I don't know if you see this, but to me, this is awesome, right? I love this when I read stuff like this, these little nuggets. I start drilling down into the Hebrew and I grab it. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's unbelievable. Here he's revealing who he is, but he's doing it in a way that's it's a mystery, and it creates other people will stumble because of it. But if you have eyes to see, you will see it, right? Go ahead, Tyler.
So make the connection back to with this and back to the to Shiloh. How are these two?
How's this work? Okay, let me show you. Next verse. Okay, so what happens here is they do a burnt offering, okay? And they offer a burnt offering, but it's in that transient period. Shiloh had been burned to the ground, okay? And it's during this period of time where they could do private altars. And the Lord allows this to happen in this period of time. So it's a little small window where Samson's going to be born within a year. He's going to rise up, and it's in this whole window where the tabernacle had been destroyed. And so that's what I'm getting. And this is where I was going to go with here. You'll see what I'm talking about here. In 1 Samuel 7:1, it says, then the men of Kiriath Yearim came and took the ark of the Lord and brought it into the house of Abinadab on the hill and consecrated Eleazar his son to keep the ark of the Lord. So Abinadab was probably a priest from the line of Aaron, and most likely from the line of Pinchas or Phineas, depending on how you pronounce it. And so this is when, and he would eventually be one of the Zadoks. So here's a splitting of the priesthoods taking place, okay? But here it says in verse 2, so it was that the ark remained in Kiriath Jearim a long time. It was there 20 years. And all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. So let me explain what we're talking about here is Samson was judge for 20 years. Eli's dead. Samuel hasn't taken the yoke yet of judgeships. So Samson is in this small window here, offering a burnt offering, not at Shiloh, because it's been burned to the ground, and he becomes the judge right after this, and he leads to finally his death in Gaza. Keep in mind, it's going to be 100 years of just nonstop warfare with the Philistines, that would last a total of 700 years as a thorn in their side. Now, in 1 Samuel 21 verse 1, it says, so this is later down the road, but it's telling where the tabernacle was as opposed to the ark. It says, now David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Now this is, all right, so Ahimelech is a descendant from Eli. He's probably a grandson or a great grandson that's taken the mantle. So you're having a priest serve at Kiriath Jearim, and then you're having a priest serve here at Nob. Two different a splitting in the priesthood. Okay. And Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, why are you alone and no one is with you? And so the priest said in verse 9, this is really interesting. He says, the sword of Goliath, or Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, there it is, wrapped in the cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is no other except that one that's here. And David said, there is none like it. Give it to me. So he takes the basically he takes this the sword of Goliath, and he's going to go off to defend himself. But where does he get the sword? It's sitting in the tabernacle in the area where the ark was supposed to be, but it wasn't there because the ark was 20 miles away. Okay. Do you follow me? Tyler, does that make sense? Okay. I know I'm kind of it may seem like I'm all over the board, but I'm going to lay it out here. It'll come. We'll land a plane here in a minute. Now, just to kind of get an idea, I want to give you a picture of what you're looking at. Okay. So, we look down here, and where you find Ebenezer originally. Where is it here? Beth Shemesh. Okay, so last week, Beth Shemesh is where the ark was, and then everybody got plagued. So they moved it from Beth Shemesh right here where my cursor is, and they moved it up to Kiriath Jearim. You see that? So they moved it up a ways. Okay. Now, Judah is down mainly in the Hebron area. That's where they are concentrated, but their tribe is up to the area of Bethlehem. Okay. And this is important for this whole story of the kingdom coming together. So Samuel, when he rises to power here in a few verses, he's going to operate in this area right here. Okay. And this area right here is in the tribal area of Benjamin. Okay. He does not operate either in Jebus, which is the edge. This is by the northern end of Judah. He doesn't operate down there because it's still in the control of a Canaanite people. But he's north of it, operating in this area in the tribe of Benjamin. That is why Benjamin rises, somebody from Benjamin becomes a king in the land. And why does that happen? It's because Israel and Judah are not going to come together unless it was somebody from the middle ground, in the middle area. Okay. That's what I'm kind of getting at here. All right. Does that make sense? All right. This is real important because one of the reasons, if you fast forward to Paul, one of the reasons why Paul is called to minister to Gentiles is because he is going to serve, his tribal identity is to be a bridge between two different sides. Okay. So if you look north of here, this area is Ephraim and this area is Judah, and in the middle sits Benjamin, and they are the bridge that brings the two together. Okay. I hope you guys understand it, because this is a real critical piece to understanding why Saul was brought in to be why he was the first king as opposed to somebody from Judah. Okay, let's go on to chapter 7, verse 3. Then Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, if you return to the Lord with all your hearts, Then put away the foreign gods and the Ashtoreths. These are these totem poles from among you, and prepare your hearts for the Lord and serve him only, and he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. So the children of Israel put away the Baals and the Ashtoreths and served the Lord only. And Samuel said, gather all Israel to Mitzpah. So we go back here. Where's Mitzpah? It's right in this area right here. You see, in the tribal area of Benjamin, he has them come together. Okay. And I wanted to key on this stuff. He says, so all of the house of Israel, when you see whole or all, the word in Hebrew is kol. Okay. When you see that term here, it's referring to all 12 tribes. If kol or all is not mentioned, it just says the house of Israel, then it's only the 10 tribes. Okay. That's a
Okay.
really important part of understanding the language of what's going on here.
And something we don't
Wait, is this,
understand. Yeah, most Christians, you talk about Israel and Judah, that they don't have a clue. But if you don't understand that, you do not understand the Old Testament prophecy at
At all.
all.
You don't. You
isn't Mizpah where I can't remember. It's made the Lord watch between you and me while we were absent one from another. Where Jacob and Rachel and Rachel's father. Isn't that
Laban.
where they
No,
met? It was essentially
that's further north. That's
Okay.
further north. That's way north. In fact, it's probably about 400 miles north.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. That's and I can't remember. I know what you're talking about, but that's
It's
way
a different
north.
Mizpah. Okay.
Yes, that's right. That's right. All right, so let me go over verse 5 again. And Samuel said, gather all Israel to Mitzpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. So they gathered together at Mitzpah. They drew water and poured it out before the Lord. By the way, let me ask you guys, they're pouring water. What feast is this taking place at? Does anybody know? You'll get the
Water.
if you can get the
Passover.
that's a
Washing of the
guess.
hand.
That's a guess. It's good,
Is
Raj.
it part,
Thanks.
is
You
it
know
part
what
of the Passover?
I love Raj. He never hesitates. He's always there. He
Thank
never
you, Raj.
hesitates. Anybody else?
Well, is it a part of the week of Passover? A part of the
It's
unleavened
part.
bread?
Let me just put it this way. It's part of a 7-day Moedim, appointed time. I didn't tell you which one, but it's a part of it. And remember, there's only
That'd
2
be
of them.
Pentecost. Pentecost?
That's not 7 days.
Okay, forget it. I'm off.
Tabernacle.
Tell us who.
Tabernacles. That's right. So during
Oh,
the
yes.
during the Feast of Tabernacles, they have the water libation ceremony that takes place. And so in the first century during the temple, children that were raised in the temple, like Samuel was, they would take, if they were from the age of basically 2 to 8, they would set them on these, they had these oxes, and they put little platforms on it, and they would carry the vessels from the temple. And the children that were from the age of 9 to 12, they would take the vessels from these children, and they go in the pool of Shiloh. All right, they get the water, and then they hand it back to them, and then they would guide. They had this big ceremony, and they would go up to the temple, and then they pour out the water. And it was during this time that Yeshua says, I am the living water.
I'm the
That's
living
during a
water.
Feast of Tabernacle. Yeah, thank you.
Right.
All right.
Got that.
So
Yeah.
we're seeing a pattern that what's going on here is they've come out of a fast. They're going into a 7-day festival, and part of that 7-day festival is the water libation ceremony that takes place during the Feast of Tabernacles. And he says he drew water and poured it out before the Lord, and they fasted that day and said, there we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the children of Israel at Mitzpah. Notice that Samuel is he's still operating the territory of Benjamin and Ephraim. He's not working down in Judah at all. So this is all in the same period, some place, and he operates between these 3 towns. Now, Josephus gives a period of 32 years for Samuel and Saul combined. And this is one of those things that Tyler was mentioned earlier about the 12. In the book of Antiquities, number 6, he breaks this down that Samuel served 12 years, and then he would anoint Saul, and Saul would become king, and he would serve 20 years. Now notice before that, before Samuel's 12 years, you had Samson's 20 years that he served as judge. And so you have these two 20s that are bookends, and then Samuel, who's bringing all 12 together. He's bringing them back together. The number 12 is being used here, and this is part of this. He would be the last judge of Israel. 1 Samuel 7:7 says, "Now when the Philistines heard that the children of Israel had gathered together at Mizpah, the lords of the Philistines, these are the chiefs of the city states, went up against Israel. And when the children of Israel heard it, they were afraid of the Philistines. So the children of Israel said to Samuel, 'Do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines.'" Okay. So I titled this teaching, "Crying Out to the Lord." Some of you may have heard this before and studied this before, but the term crying out to the Lord is a legal term in Scripture. What it does is when somebody does cry out, it brings God's attention. He basically, there's some steps that take place, and I'm going to show you these steps. But here in verse 8, do not cease to cry out, because they knew that if they did not cry out, then they would lose at the hands of the Philistines. So there was a major spiritual war going on between the two. So I'm going to show you that here in a minute. So what I was saying earlier, whenever you see this term in Scripture, crying out, it's a legal term. We see this in Egypt with the Pharaoh, and I'm going to read it here in a minute. And we're going to see this in Book of Revelations, the same term being applied. So in Exodus 2, verse 23, "Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them." Now, I hear commentaries all the time. Well, how can God all forget something, or how is he going to remember when I thought he was sovereign, he knew all things? No, you got to understand that the term crying out is a legal term that brings out the judge. The judge sits in a position of ruling. He's going to make some judgments. And so before, when Samuel says, "Do not cease to cry out," he's basically saying, stay in intercessory prayer, continue on your knees, continue crying out, because we don't know when the divine counsel in the heavenly realm is going to act on our behalf. So stay on your knees, stay crying out. Okay, it's really critical terms. We're seeing it here in 1 Samuel. We'll see it here in Exodus 2. Does everybody understand that? Now, in your personal lives, this is a very, very important process of your walk. Okay, we pray. Apostle Paul tells us to pray constantly. We all ought to pray all the time, right? But praying keeps us the communication and the relationship with Yeshua. That's what that does. Okay. But crying out invokes something legal. Okay. And that legal invoke is what's going to bring a change in the covenant. Okay. Notice what he says here. So God heard the groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's what you're doing, is you're bringing to the Lord right before him the covenant that you came into when you accepted Yeshua as Messiah. I'll give you an example here in Revelations. Okay. So now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman. Who's the woman?
Israel.
Thank you. Israel, who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time, a times, and half a time. We can talk about the great tribulation from the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out. Okay, so from a spiritual, some people just say, well, this is just imagery. Apparently not. It's much more than that. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. So by intention, Satan is using weather to kill the people of Israel, to kill people in the kingdom by intention. Okay. Does any of that sound familiar, guys? Does any of that sound familiar in the last few weeks? We have, that's exactly right. By intention, we have weather that killed people, believers in the Most High, who are in the covenant. These are children who are going to Christian camps. So by intention, don't ever think that the enemy is not trying to kill you. He always is doing this. All right. And so I don't know what's
Especially
going,
those who believe. The believer is
especially those who
faithful.
believe. That's right.
Right.
So let's keep going. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood at the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman. So we don't know who cried out, but it's understood that there was crying out by Israel for mercy. Okay. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Well, that was phase one of the war. But notice what he does there. Israel cries out. God provides a means to eliminate the danger. And then Satan turns his attention from Israel and then targets the rest of the Commonwealth of Israel. It says, and the dragon was enraged with the woman. He's enraged with Israel, but he can't do anything about it. So then he goes to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and has the testimony of Yeshua, the Messiah. Okay, so we're looking here in Revelations 12, crying out, and God intervenes by, in this case, of water. In the case in Egypt, he intervenes, he sends Moses, who gets him out. In the case of here with Samuel, he's intervening with the Philistines and allowing them to defeat the enemy. Okay, so these are all cases, legal cases, where the covenant is being invoked. We cry out to the Lord for the covenant, and then he comes to our rescue. All right, any questions on that? That's a lot, but very, very important.
Yeah.
Clear as mud.
No, very clear.
Okay.
Clear.
So verse 9 of 1 Samuel 7. And Samuel took a suckling lamb, this is a newborn lamb, and offered as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. Okay. Remember, Shiloh is not standing. Where does he do this at? He does this at Mitzpah, right? Mitzpah, the tabernacle nor the ark is either place, right? The ark is at Kiryat Jearim, right? And the tabernacle is at Nob. So here at Mitzpah, he's offering up a burnt offering. This is what I'm trying to key into it. Is the Mishnah was telling us that when it wasn't at Shiloh, wasn't at Jerusalem, burnt offerings could be offered up in places that were not designated because of the circumstances that took place. So then go ahead, Mom.
Well, those who weren't here last week don't understand part of what you're saying, because the ark was not where it was supposed to be, because they had taken it on that cart by the Philistines,
Yeah.
and then they dropped it off back at the ark back in another place, but they still hadn't taken it back to the tabernacle where it should have been. That's
Yeah.
why
So
there's a separation.
you can see here, well, yes, we kind of alluded that to Mom when we started off, but it came out of Beth Shemesh, went up to Kiryat, and that's where the Ark of the Covenant sat, right there with the priests who were caretakers of it. And then we have Nob. This is where the tabernacle. But notice they did not come together; they stayed separate. But up here at Mitzpah, this is where they're offering the burnt offering. They don't do it at Nob, and they don't do it at Kiryat Jearim. This is very interesting. Why? It's because no longer Shiloh is where God had placed his name. So there was flexibility to be able to do it at this time in some other place. Okay. So then Samuel cried out to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answered him. Now, as Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, Philistines drew near to the battle against Israel. But the Lord the Lord thundered with loud thunder upon the Philistines that day, and so confused them that they were overcome before Israel. And the men of Israel went out of Mitzpah and pursued the Philistines and drove them back as far as Beth-kar. Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mitzpah and Shin, and he called it Ebenezer. Now, the word Eben is stone, a large stone in Hebrew. And so what they did here is they marked the battlefield as a place where God had intervened. It's kind of a memorial, if you will. It's what they did. Not a place to worship or offerings, but it was a memorial of God intervening And so Samuel set up that stone there. By the way, these standing stones are all over Israel. And if you ever go there, there's some standing stones. If you go to, so when you go to Jerusalem, I went to the New Jerusalem side. There's a huge mall, and so we had a free day off once. So I went to the New Jerusalem, and there's these standing stones that are right next to the mall in the parking lot that they've never demolished. It's still there to this very day, which
There, right.
which is kind of interesting. Um, okay, so I want to show you some patterns here. So when the crying out takes place, there's these steps that I want you to follow here. So there's a step one is there's this fear of loss of life, and people begin to seek help and they begin to cry out. Okay, so the proper thing to do for the laity, the congregation, is to cry out for the elders to step in or leadership to step in, because they're going to start the process of interceding. It doesn't eliminate the laity from being part of the intercessory prayer and part of that process, but there's steps. Laity comes to the people, comes to the elders. The elders begin to start the process of intercessory prayer. They fast all as a community. That's a third step. Leadership offers a burnt offering. In this case, today we would require this. It's not done, but what was required is for the leadership, the elders would consecrate themselves. They would clean themselves up. They would repent. They would put themselves in so they could be in that place for the people. Right? That's part of consecration. And then the prayers of that body, the saints, will go up, and God establishes what's called a divine council. And we're going to spend more time on divine councils later on. But in the divine council, God will then make a decision on how he's going to go about and intervene. Okay. And so in many cases, simple cases, he'll just send a messenger out, dispatch. But if it's really a complicated issue, like we're going to read here in Daniel, then it may require more than one. It may require a whole army of angels interceding on the behalf of the nation. So we read here in Daniel 10:13, but the prince of kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. What happened? Daniel was calling out. He was fasting. He's interceding for the people because that 70 years was coming up. And so during that process of him doing that, God sent messengers out. He sent people out. But sometimes Satan is strong, or in these cases, some of these principalities are super strong, that they stop the divine council's efforts. Okay. And so what happens is there's a kinetic type warfare that takes place that we can't see. And I'll give you a perfect example of kinetic warfare that took place was during the time when the Amalekites were fighting against Israel. Moses had to keep his hands rise in the air. When he lowered it, what happened? Then they began losing the battle. It wasn't that they weren't superior fighters or they didn't have the numbers to the Amalekites. The issue was the principalities that were fighting for the Amalekites. When they were raising their hands up and they were interceding in prayer, it allowed for God's divine counsel to intervene and deal with the spiritual threat while Israel dealt with the physical threat, or both. Okay. And so in these cases, when these things happen, there's a kinetic warfare that's going on that we cannot see, but it's very real, and it does happen. And finally, the enemy is defeated. It could take days, it could take months, it could take years. Okay, we don't know how long it takes. God establishes a timeline there based on the people and their repentance and how they intercede and their consistency on it. But it's really important that whatever timeline, this is the process that we defeat our spiritual enemy. Okay. And just because it's physical to your eyes doesn't mean there's spiritual forces that are intervening that you can't see. All right. So the Philistines weren't defeated completely until Alexander the Great. It would take 700 years before the thorn in Israel's side was finally removed. And by the time the Philistines were removed from that side, they by the time they were removed, Israel was no longer had their sovereignty. They had lost their sovereignty, and eventually the Greeks would rule over them. So the sad part about this whole thing is that the people did not stay on their knees and cry out until the Philistines were removed. So that's why it was a temporary defeat. 1 Samuel 7:13. So the Philistines were subdued, and they did not come anymore into the territory of Israel. They were still there, but they didn't come in anymore. And the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. So those 12 years, they got reprieve from the Philistines. Then the cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron to Gath, and Israel recovered its territory from the hands of the Philistines. Also, there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. Now, that's very interesting because the Amorites are on the east side of the land. So even though Gilead and Reuben and Gad were not being threatened by the Philistines, God still put a thorn in their side and left the Amorites there, and they weren't completely removed and caused them consternation, which they would eventually defeat under David. And Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went from year to year on a circuit to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah. And I want to go back to that map. You can see that. Okay, so they pushed the Philistines back to this border, okay, between Ekron down to Gath. So this is kind of the border that they established kind of that front line. And then, like I was telling you earlier, he operated between Bethel, Mizpah, and Gilgal. He worked the circuit right in through here, all through the area of Benjamin. Okay. All right, let me stop right there with the stop with the trying to find my here we go. I'm trying to turn off the
Recording.
yeah, it won't stop.
Uh-oh.
So we're gonna have to ask, it won't stop recording. Oh, there it is. Maybe we'll do it up here.